At the beginning of the summer, I volunteered to help with a simple mural for one of the local libraries. My initial assignment was to design a tree for a narrow wall and have it be basic enough in scope for someone else to trace it out and to paint it. But because I can't help myself, I ended up spending over 50 hours doing everything myself and making it more complicated than anyone had asked for in the process. After our initial discussion about the project, I started to sketch before I had the actual dimensions of the wall. I'm sure I could have waited, but I wanted to get started while I had the momentum from offering my help and with all of the details still fresh in my mind. So, going in, I knew that the wall was already sage green and that the furniture and base trim were both shades of gray. Color-wise, I was to use the same grays that were already there and to pick greens that complemented the wall color. I vaguely knew that the tree had to be taller than it was wide, and they showed me some really graphic stock art, which is what they were using as inspiration before I got involved. I can't find it to show you, but it was like a 2D cross-section of a tree so that you could see all of the branches, and it was filled out with floating leaves. With all of that in my head, I sketched out a basic tree. At this point, I wasn't trying to stray too far from the stock art they showed me, but I did want to make the tree feel more three-dimensional. After making a clean drawing on top of my sketch, I showed my contact what I had come up with. However, despite my best efforts, I had severely misjudged the width of the wall. The working space, in actuality, was roughly 3 feet by 8 feet, way narrower than what I had imagined. But not to worry, because this is exactly why I showed off while it was just the woody bits. With a little bit of digital magic, I squished my drawing and scaled it until it was the right shape for the space. At this point though, between the gray color and the twisting branches, the tree was starting to feel really sinister. Now, I love a spooky tree, but this friend was supposed to live in a library's kids area. So far, I had been letting the reference inspiration control my output, but to move away from the dark vibes this tree was giving me, I decided that the leaves needed to fully cover the branches wherever it made sense. In the end, I settled on having the tree trunk sandwiched between 2 layers of leaves, and with a bit of line work on top of the foliage, the basic design was complete. The design was approved pretty quickly, and that could have been the end of my involvement. I could have walked away and let it be whatever they made of it. But I kept doing that thing that you do if you're an artist. You know, when you finish a piece and then you find yourself staring at it over and over again over the next few days. And truthfully, I was really proud of this design. Before I knew what I was doing, I had volunteered again to help transfer it onto the wall, and soon after, to just paint the damn thing while I was at it. We thought that transferring the image would be reasonably straightforward. The plan was to use a projector so I could trace the artwork, but we couldn't back it up far enough from the wall to do it in one go. Instead, I projected the top half and then tilted the projector down to do the bottom. There's an outlet on the wall that I had sort of accounted for in my drawing, but I never actually measured and figured out exactly where it was. In fact, this is one of the main reasons why I wanted to help transfer the image. I ended up having to fudge the drawing in that area so that the outlet is left untouched. I also ended up freehanding the trunk a bit to make everything work and to look right. After I had finished making those tweaks to the design, it was finally time to start painting. And if I'm being honest, this was mostly tedious. The background layer required a steady hand for all of the crisp outer edges of the leaves, and the dark green paint didn't have great coverage. I ended up having to do 3 coats before moving on to the trunk. The gray paint was way nicer to work with since I only needed 1 coat in most spots, and the dark gray that I outlined with was equally good. By the time I got to the foreground, I was already hours and hours into the project, and I was so ready for it to be over. So you can imagine my dismay as I began to realize that I really didn't like the way that it was turning out. To me, there was just way too much contrast between each layer of the image, making the whole thing lack harmony. On top of that, I feel like the original design didn't actually look as good when it was 8 feet tall. It's great to look at on a small screen like a computer screen or a phone, but when it's bigger than you, it's just really boring and flat. and honestly, it just felt kind of amateur. So, after considering my next move, I started to work on the background layer again, bringing some light into that darkness. I didn't really know what I was doing, but after a timid start, I began to define leaves around the edges of the tree's crown, adding a little bit of noise and texture into the deep shade of green. I absolutely love what this change did to the piece, but it made it even more clear how boring the trunk and the front leaves were. So, next I moved on to the trunk and began to shade the branches to give the tree more depth. I generally darkened the areas that led up into the leaves and left other areas more light if they were more open to the air. While I worked on the form shadows, I also started to play with texture, dragging paint across the branches and trunk to render in bark. At this point, I was really feeling great about the background leaves and the tree's wooden bits. But as those two elements became more harmonized, my worry about the front leaves deepened. I decided I couldn't really assess what I wanted to do before I did the outlines. I knew that they would help to tie everything together since I was using the dark green from the background for them. And I have to say, the outlines really did make a difference. Before I called it a day, I went in with a slightly darker green and decided to add some graphic shading to the leaf clusters. This helped to further tie the bright green up front to the dark leaves in the back, and generally made a positive impact on the three-dimensionality of the piece. After a handful of touch-ups and minor tweaks, the mural was finally complete. This was such a cool opportunity to have, and such a great way to get back into traditional painting. If anyone who agreed to let me do this project is seeing this, when I offered to do the mural, I hadn't really painted traditionally in like 15 years. So in preparation for this project, I made a small test painting to see how screwed I was. You can see how that went in this video over here. Yeah, sorry. Like this video if you liked it, and consider subscribing.